The morning Sadie Beckett fixed the broken gate latch for the first time. She told herself it was simply because the sound of it banging in the wind was keeping her awake at night, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the broad-shouldered rancher who rode past her property every single morning at 6:30. The year was 1878, and the town of Harlow Creek, Texas, sat in the basin of a wide valley where the red earth met the pale blue of an enormous sky. It was a small place, not yet 20 years old, built up from nothing by men and women who had crossed the plains with little more than hope and stubbornness packed into their wagons. The town had a general store run by a man named Horace Pell, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, a saloon called the Dusty Boot, a post office, and roughly 400 souls who all knew every piece of one another's business whether they wanted to or not. Sadie Beckett had lived in Harlow Creek for 6 years. She had come out from Tennessee with her husband, Daniel Beckett, in the spring of 1872, full of the kind of wild optimism that the frontier seemed to pull out of people like a fishhook. Daniel had been a good man, a carpenter by trade, with large, capable hands and a laugh that could fill a room. He had built their house himself, a solid 2-room structure with a covered porch, and then he had begun adding to it piece by piece, as though building their future one board at a time. He had built the fence around the property too, a proper split-rail fence with a gate that latched on the south side of the yard, facing the main road that cut through the valley. Daniel Beckett had died of a fever in the autumn of 1875. It came on fast, and it took him in 9 days, and Sadie had nursed him through every one of those 9 days without sleeping more than a handful of hours. She was 26 years old when she buried him in the church cemetery on the hill, and she had stood at that grave in the cold October wind and told herself that she would not fall apart. She had a farm to run. She had chickens and a kitchen garden and a small herd of cattle that a neighboring rancher named Clem Dorsey helped her manage for a fair percentage of the profit. She had the house Daniel built, and she intended to keep it. By 1878, Sadie was 29 years old, and she was known in Harlow Creek as a woman of considerable competence and very little softness. That was not entirely accurate. She was soft in the places that mattered, in the way she spoke to her chickens in the early mornings, in the way she pressed wildflowers between the pages of the books she kept on the shelf above the fireplace, in the way she still slept on her side of the bed even though there was no reason to anymore. But she kept those soft places private. The world had a way of finding the tender spots and pressing on them, and Sadie Beckett had learned to protect hers. The gate had been broken for 3 weeks before she finally decided to do something about it. The latch was a simple iron piece that had corroded and worked itself loose from the post. Every morning the wind came up from the south and caught the gate and swung it wide open, and then banged it shut again, over and over, a sound like a slow and lazy heartbeat that echoed through the yard. She had been meaning to fix it since she first noticed it, but October had been busy and cold, and there had always been something more pressing. On the morning she finally fixed it, she had risen at 5 o'clock as she always did, dressed in her dark wool skirt and her cream-colored blouse, pulled on her leather-work gloves, and gone out to the barn for the small toolbox Daniel had left behind. She found the right nail and a piece of bent iron wire, and she crouched down in front of the gate in the cold gray light before sunrise and worked the latch back into place. It took her about 10 minutes. She stood up and opened and closed the gate 3 times to make sure it held. It held. She went back inside to start the fire in the stove and put the coffee on. Roy Ramsey rode past her property at 6:30, same as every morning. He rode a big gray horse named Luther, and he wore a brown hat with a rolled brim and a canvas coat that had seen better days, and he did not look in her direction as he passed. He never did. Roy Ramsey was 32 years old, and he had come to Harlow Creek in the spring of 1876, about a year after Daniel Beckett's death. He had ridden in on Luther with a worn saddle and a bedroll, and a reputation for knowing horses better than most men knew their own families. He had hired on with Elias Horn, the largest ranch operation in the valley, as a horse trainer and general ranch hand, and within 6 months he had become Horn's most trusted foreman. He was a quiet man, the kind of quiet that was not sullen but simply careful, as though he had learned that words had weight, and he was not interested in wasting them. He had dark eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red stone as the valley walls, and he moved with the particular unhurried ease of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors. The people of Harlow Creek liked Roy Ramsey well enough. He paid his debts. He treated his horses kindly. He showed up when there was hard work to be done, and he bought a round at the Dusty Boot once in a while without being asked. He was not a man who sought company, but he did not refuse it either. He boarded at the Horn Ranch on the far end of the valley, which meant his daily ride to town and back took him past the Beckett property twice a day, morning and evening. Sadie had noticed him, of course. Everyone noticed Roy Ramsey, partly because he was the sort of man who was impossible not to notice, and partly because in a town of 400 people, every face was familiar. She had spoken to him a handful of times, the way you spoke to people in a small town, a word of greeting at the general store, a brief exchange about the weather at the post office. He was always polite. He always called her Mrs. Beckett, and he always took his hat off when he spoke to her, which she thought was a nice thing. She had not, in those brief exchanges, ever thought about him in any particular way, or so she told herself. The truth was more complicated, the way truth in matters of the heart usually is. She had thought about him in the way you think about something just out of reach, not with any real intention but with a kind of wistful awareness. He was a handsome man. He was a decent man. And she had been alone for 3 years in a way that had become a permanent condition rather than a temporary circumstance. She was not looking for a husband. She had persuaded herself of that with considerable thoroughness. But sometimes, in the early mornings when the light was still new and the world was quiet, she would stand on her porch with her coffee and watch him ride past, and she would feel something shift inside her like a door swinging open just slightly before swinging closed again. She was doing this on the second morning, the morning after she had first fixed the gate latch, when she noticed that the latch was broken again. She stood on her porch with her coffee mug held in both hands and stared at the gate. The wind was moving the gate gently, swinging it in slow arcs, and the latch hung loose from the post again. She could not understand how it had come undone so quickly. She had nailed it firmly. She had tested it 3 times. She set her coffee down on the porch railing and went inside for her gloves and toolbox. This time she took more care with the repair. She cleaned the corrosion off the iron latch with a rough piece of cloth, drove 2 nails instead of 1, and wrapped the connection point with a length of wire that she twisted tight with a pair of pliers. She worked in the cold, her breath coming in small clouds, the sky lightening gradually from gray to the pale orange of early morning. When she was done, the latch was considerably sturdier than it had ever been, even before it had first broken. She was just rising from her crouch when Roy Ramsey rode past. He was at his usual time, 6:30, and for a moment the angle of the road and the position of the gate put him directly in her line of sight, close enough that she could see the white vapor of Luther's breath in the cold air. He looked over. Their eyes met. He touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers in a brief, automatic greeting. She nodded. He rode on. Sadie Beckett stood at her gate with her pliers in her hand, and felt her face go warm in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She went back inside and drank her coffee and told herself that she was being ridiculous. That evening she baked a pie, which was something she did when she was thinking too hard about something and needed to do something with her hands. She made an apple pie with the last of the dried apples from the barrel in the cellar, and the whole house smelled warm and sweet, and she sat at her kitchen table after supper with a small piece of pie and a cup of tea and read from the novel she had borrowed from the minister's wife, and she was almost entirely not thinking about Roy Ramsey. Almost. On the third morning, she went out at 5:30 and found the gate open again. This time she stopped and really looked at it. The latch had not simply come loose. It had been pulled clean off the post, the nails drawn out, the wire unwound. Sadie straightened up and looked at the road, and then she looked at the gate, and then she looked at the road again. Something about the situation had shifted from irritating to peculiar. A wind could loosen a nail. A wind could not unwind wire. Something or someone had been at her gate. She thought about this for a moment, chewing her lower lip, and then she went back inside for her toolbox. This third repair was the most thorough of the three. She used a longer nail, a heavier iron pin that she found at the bottom of Daniel's toolbox, and she reinforced the entire mechanism so that it would have taken a determined effort to remove it again. She worked slowly and carefully, aware in a way she had not been on the previous 2 mornings of the quality of the silence around her, the pre-dawn stillness of the valley, the distant sound of a coyote somewhere on the ridge. She was finishing the repair when she heard hoof beats. Not Roy Ramsey's usual unhurried walk. These were faster, more purposeful, approaching from the direction of the Horn Ranch. She stood and turned, and there was Luther, the big gray horse, coming down the road at a ground-eating trot, and Roy Ramsey was in the saddle, and he was looking directly at her gate. He slowed as he drew level with her property and brought Luther to a stop at the edge of the road. For a moment he just looked at her, at the gate, at the toolbox open in the dirt, at the pliers in her gloved hand. "That's the third morning," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the same quality as his movement, and it took Sadie a moment to find her voice because she had not expected him to stop. "I beg your pardon," she said. "3 mornings," he said. "I've ridden past this gate 3 mornings, and 3 mornings you've been crouched down in the cold fixing it." She straightened her spine. "The latch keeps coming loose." Roy Ramsey looked at the gate for a long moment, and then he looked back at her, and there was something in his dark eyes that she could not quite read, something careful and considering. "May I step down?" he asked. She gestured with the pliers in a way that she hoped communicated that he was welcome. He swung down from Luther in one smooth motion, and looped the reins around the fence rail, and came to stand beside her at the gate. He was taller up close than he appeared at a distance, broader through the shoulders, and he smelled of leather and horses and the cold morning air. He crouched down and examined the latch with his bare hands, turning the mechanism, testing the nails, feeling the wire. He was quiet for a long time, then he stood up. "This repair is solid," he said. "Whoever took this apart the second time had to work at it." Sadie blinked. "You knew it was taken apart." "I noticed the gate was open 2 mornings ago when I rode past in the evening," he said. "And it was open again yesterday evening. But each morning when I came through it was fixed." He paused. "I started leaving earlier so I could see who was out here." She stared at him. "You started leaving earlier?" "Yes, so you could watch me fix my gate." He had the grace to look slightly abashed at that, or at least his jaw shifted in a way that she thought might be his version of looking abashed. "I wasn't watching you fix your gate," he said. "I was trying to figure out who was breaking it." "Do you know who was breaking it?" He was quiet for a moment, and something changed in his expression, something that might have been reluctance. "I have a suspicion," he said. Sadie crossed her arms. "Tell me." Roy looked at the road, then back at her. "There's a boy who works at the Horn Ranch, name of Pete Aldridge. He's 17 and he's foolish the way 17-year-old boys usually are. Last week at supper he said, in what I think he believed was a funny thing to say, that a widow woman on the South Road was going to be mighty lonely this winter." Roy's jaw tightened slightly. "I told him that was not a respectful thing to say about any woman. He didn't take kindly to being corrected." Sadie felt a flicker of anger, hot and quick. "And you think he was breaking my latch out of spite?" "I think he was breaking it because he thought it would be funny to watch a widow woman have to fix things over and over. He thought it was amusing." Roy's voice was flat in the way that indicated he found it anything but. "I'll speak to him today. It won't happen again." "I can fight my own battles," Sadie said, and she meant it. "I don't doubt it," Roy said immediately, and she looked at him sharply because she expected argument, not agreement. But it's my problem that I brought onto your property because it was my failure to impress upon Pete that there are lines a man does not cross. So it's mine to fix too." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze without flinching. "All right," she said. He nodded. He glanced at the gate once more, then back at her. "You do good repair work," he said, and it was said simply, without condescension, just as a plain observation. "My husband was a carpenter," she said. "I paid attention." Something moved across his face at the mention of her husband, something brief and respectful. "I knew Daniel Beckett by reputation," he said. "I arrived after he passed, but everyone I met spoke well of him." "He was a good man," Sadie said, and the words were steady in her mouth, the way they were now after 3 years. The ache was still there, but it had changed shape, from something sharp and jagged to something rounder, more like a smooth stone she carried. Roy nodded. He took his hat off and ran a hand through his dark hair and put it back on. "Well," he said, "I've kept you from your morning long enough, Mrs. Beckett." "Sadie," she said. He blinked. "If you're going to ride past my gate every day and watch me fix things," she said, "you may as well call me Sadie." For the first time a smile moved across Roy Ramsey's face. It was a slow smile, like the sun coming over a ridgeline, and it changed his face entirely, made it warmer and younger. "Roy," he said. "I know who you are," she said. He laughed at that, a brief, quiet laugh, and swung himself back up onto Luther. "Good morning, Sadie." "Good morning, Roy." He rode on toward town, and she stood at her gate and watched him go. And the warmth in her chest had absolutely nothing to do with the sun that was now beginning to clear the ridge. She thought about it for the rest of the morning while she gathered eggs and fed the chickens and pulled the last of the late-season carrots from the kitchen garden. She thought about the way he had crouched down at her gate and touched the mechanism with his hands, not to take over, not to demonstrate anything, just to understand. She thought about the way he had said her name when she gave him permission to use it, careful and deliberate, like he was placing something valuable down on a table. By noon she had decided that she was going to stop thinking about it and go into town for the supplies she had been meaning to collect for a week. The general store of Horace Pell was a low, cluttered building that smelled of coffee beans and lamp oil and the particular dusty sweetness of dried goods stored in bulk. Sadie tied her mare, a speckled gray she had named Pearl, to the post outside and went in with her list in her pocket. Horace Pell was a stout, cheerful man who knew the price of everything and the value of gossip. He greeted Sadie with his usual enthusiasm and began pulling items from the shelves before she had even finished reciting her list. "Heard you had some trouble with your gate," he said when she was halfway through, not quite asking but leaving room for her to answer. Sadie looked at him calmly. "News travels fast," she said. "In Harlow Creek," he grinned. "News doesn't travel, Mrs. Beckett, it just always seems to already be everywhere." She allowed herself a small smile at that. "The latch was loose," she said. "It's fixed now." "Roy Ramsey was in here a while ago," Horace said conversationally, measuring out coffee with a tin scoop. "Said he needed a box of wire nails. Said he was helping a neighbor with a repair." Sadie felt something still inside her. "Did he?" "Brought back some good heavy galvanized nails too, the kind that hold up through anything." Horace set the coffee on the counter. "Good man, Roy Ramsey. Solid." She said nothing more about it, paid for her goods, and drove home in her wagon through the cold afternoon. But when she got back to her gate and swung it open, she noticed something she had not noticed before. Someone had gone back over her repair work. The latch was now supported by a second piece of iron bracketing, carefully fitted, and 3 galvanized nails had been added to reinforce the post. The work was precise and professional and had been done sometime while she was in town. She stood at her gate for a long moment. She went inside and started the fire and thought about that for a long time. The next day was Sunday, which meant church, and Sadie put on her good blue dress and her wool coat and drove Pearl and the wagon up the hill to the white-painted church, where the Reverend Morrow spoke in the rolling cadences of someone who truly believed every word he said. The congregation of Harlow Creek filled the pews, and Sadie sat with the Dorsey family as she usually did. next to Clem Dorsey's wife, Margaret, who was her closest friend in the town. Margaret Dorsey was a small, energetic woman with red hair going gray and opinions about everything, and she had been attempting to reintroduce Sadie to the world of romantic possibility for approximately 2 years with a persistence that Sadie found alternately touching and exhausting. "Roy Ramsey is 2 rows back," Margaret said, barely a whisper before the service had even begun. "Good morning to you too, Margaret," Sadie said. "He's looking this way." "He is not. He absolutely is." "Sadie, when was the last time you let a man look at you?" "I am looking at the Reverend," Sadie said firmly, "as one does in church." The service proceeded. Reverend Morrow spoke about stewardship and the duty of neighbors to one another, which Sadie found uncomfortably apt given recent events. The congregation sang 2 hymns. The collection plate was passed, and through all of it, Sadie was very carefully not aware of who was sitting 2 rows behind her. After the service, in the pale winter sunlight outside the church doors, the congregation milled and spoke in the unhurried way of people who had nowhere immediately pressing to be. Sadie was speaking with Margaret about whether the general store might be getting a new shipment of proper woolen fabric before winter truly set in, when she heard Roy Ramsey's voice behind her. "Good morning, Mrs. Beckett," she turned. He was standing with his hat in his hands and a man she did not recognize beside him, a younger fellow with sandy hair and a nervous demeanor. "Good morning," she said. Roy's jaw set slightly. "I wanted to introduce Pete Aldridge," he said. "He works out at Horn's Ranch." The young man, Pete, looked like he would rather be anywhere on earth except standing where he was. He was around 17, as Roy had said, with the unfinished look of someone who had not quite grown into his bones yet, and his ears were red. "Ma'am," Pete said. He swallowed. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Beckett. I behaved poorly toward your property, and I'm sorry for it. It was a disrespectful thing, and I won't do it again." Sadie looked at the young man for a moment. He held her gaze, which took some nerve, she thought, and the apology was clearly sincere even if it was also clearly extracted. She thought about what Roy had said, that Pete was 17 and foolish the way 17-year-old boys usually were, and she thought about the fact that a boy who had done a mean thing and was now being made to face the person he had done it to was learning something worth learning. "I accept your apology," she said, "and I hope you'll think more carefully about what constitutes entertainment at someone else's expense, Mr. Aldridge." "Yes, ma'am," Pete said, and his ears got redder. Roy gave the young man a brief nod of dismissal and Pete made his escape. Roy turned back to Sadie. "Thank you for that," he said quietly. "Thank you for bringing him to me," she said. "He needed to apologize. It mattered that he did it to your face." She nodded. "The repair you did on my gate," she said, and she watched his face. "That was well done." He was quiet for a moment. "I had the nails in my pocket," he said. "Roy Ramsey," she said. "I am a grown woman who has been running a farm alone for 3 years. I can tell when something has been added to my gate." He looked at her with those dark eyes, and then the corner of his mouth moved. "It seemed like the right thing to do," he said. "You could have knocked on my door." "I wasn't sure you'd want me to," he said, and there was something honest and unguarded in his voice just then, something that surprised her with its directness. She held his gaze. "I think," she said carefully, "that if you have occasion to knock on my door, you should knock." He was very still for a moment. Around them the congregation moved and spoke, and the winter sun cast sharp shadows. And Sadie Beckett was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she had not been in a long time. "I'll bear that in mind," Roy said, and his voice was low and warm, and he put his hat back on and touched the brim and walked away, and she turned back to Margaret, who was looking at her with an expression of barely suppressed triumph. "Not a word," Sadie said. "I wasn't going to say anything," Margaret said. "You were going to say several things." "I was going to say," Margaret said, "that you might want to smile occasionally. A man can't tell if he's welcome if you keep that face like you're doing sums." Sadie did laugh at that, despite herself. He knocked on her door that Thursday. She heard the knock at 3:30 in the afternoon, and she came from the kitchen wiping her hands on her apron, and when she opened the door, Roy Ramsey was standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and a look of calm determination. "I have some business in town on Saturday morning," he said. "I thought, if you had business in town as well, perhaps we might ride in together." It was not what she had expected him to say. She had expected something more circuitous, some invented reason, something with more deniability. The straightforwardness of it surprised her. "I do need to go into town on Saturday," she said. "Good," he said. "I'll come by at 9. 9 is fine," she said. He nodded, put his hat on, and walked back to Luther, who was hitched to the porch rail. She watched from the doorway as he mounted and turned the horse and rode back down the road, and she felt something very much like being 16 years old again, which was an absurd feeling for a 29-year-old widow, and which she decided she did not entirely dislike. She told Margaret about it at the well the next morning, when they met by coincidence with their water buckets in the cold air. Margaret received the information with the restraint of someone physically biting down on everything they wanted to say. "Very practical," was what Margaret said. "It's a trip to town," Sadie said. "That's all." "Of course," Margaret said. They looked at each other. "He was very straightforward about it," Sadie said. "Good quality in a man," Margaret said. "He didn't make any pretense about why he wanted to come by." "Even better," Margaret said. Sadie picked up her bucket. "Stop making that face." "I'm not making any face," Margaret said, making an extraordinary face. Saturday morning came in clear and cold. The sky above Harlow Creek an almost shocking shade of blue. The red earth of the valley frozen hard and sparkling with frost. Sadie wore her best everyday dress, which was the deep green wool one, and her good wool coat, and she was standing on her porch when Roy rode up on Luther at precisely 9 o'clock. He had the big gray horse, and he was leading a second animal, a sweet-faced bay mare with a blaze on her nose. "She's gentle," he said from the saddle. "I thought you might prefer to ride rather than drive a wagon if we're just going into town." Sadie looked at the bay mare and then back at him. "I have my own horse," she said. "I know," he said, "but Pearl's been limping slightly on the left foreleg this week. I noticed when you drove past the ranch Tuesday. This mare is easy as a rocking chair." Sadie stared at him. "You noticed my horse was limping. Old Pete Aldridge might not be the most attentive horseman," Roy said, "but I am." She went into the barn and looked at Pearl's left foreleg, and sure enough the horse flinched slightly when she ran her hand down the cannon bone. She came back out and looked at Roy without saying anything. "I'll take a look at her properly when we get back," he said. "Probably just a bruise." She went back inside for her gloves and her pocket money, and then she came out and let Roy hold the bay mare's head while she mounted from the fence rail, because she would not ask him to help her mount even if he clearly intended to offer. He said nothing about this. He simply waited until she was settled and then mounted Luther, and they rode out side by side onto the frozen road toward town. For the first quarter-mile they rode in the easy silence of two people who were both comfortable with silence, and then Roy said, "How long have you had Pearl?" "She was Daniel's horse originally," Sadie said. "She came with us from Tennessee. She's 12 now." "Good age for a mare that's been well kept," he said. "She's in good condition. Whatever's bothering her leg isn't serious." "You looked at her legs before today," she said. It was not a question. He was quiet for a half-beat. "I pass your property every morning," he said. "I notice things." "What else have you noticed?" she asked, and it came out more direct than she had intended. He thought about it, which she respected. He was not the kind of man who said the first thing that came to him. "Your kitchen garden is better managed than most in the valley," he said. "You rotate the beds. Your chicken coop has a proper windbreak on the north side that most people forget to build. Your roof has a section of shingles on the east end that's going to need attention come spring." He paused. "Your porch steps creak on the third one from the bottom, which bothers you because you take a longer step over it every morning without thinking about it." She felt her breath catch slightly, not because of any of the individual observations, but because of what they accumulated to. Years of careful, consistent attention paid to the details of her daily life by a man who had never indicated it. "That's a lot of noticing," she said, keeping her voice neutral. I have a quiet ride, he said. She looked at the road ahead. The third porch step has bothered me since the spring, she said. I keep forgetting to fix it. I could take a look at it, he said, if you wanted. You are not going to fix my porch step, she said. He tilted his head. Because you want to fix it yourself. Because I don't want you to feel obligated. I don't feel obligated, he said. I feel interested. The word landed softly between them on the cold air. She did not look at him. She watched the frost-covered road and the way it curved toward the valley floor where Harlow Creek sat in its nest of cottonwood trees and scattered buildings. In porch repair, she asked carefully. In you, he said, the same way he said everything, without fanfare, without hedging, just the plain truth of it placed where she could pick it up or leave it. She did not say anything for a moment. The horses moved steadily underneath them. The cold air turned their breath to mist. I have not thought about that possibility in a long time, she said finally, and it was the most honest thing she could say. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to have thought about it. I'm just being honest about where I stand. She looked at him then. He was watching the road the way he usually did, with that quality of easy alertness, and his profile against the winter sky was steady and calm. Where do you stand? She asked. He considered that for another moment. I stand at a distance, he said. Because that's what you've needed, but I'm at the end of my patience with distance, Sadie. There it was, the end of his patience with distance. She turned the phrase over in her mind and found that it was exactly the right way to say exactly the right thing. I'm not easy, she said. I know that. I've been managing on my own for a long time and I've gotten used to it. I know that too. And I'm not interested in being managed or being taken over or any of that. I wouldn't have any idea how to manage you, he said, with a hint of wry humor, and I have enough sense to know it. She almost smiled. Good, she said. They rode the rest of the way into town in a silence that was not quiet at all, but full of all the things they had said, and all the things they had not yet said. And Sadie Beckett thought that this was perhaps the most interesting morning she had had in several years. In town they saw to their separate business, which took about an hour, and then met by arrangement at the post office steps and walked their horses down to the Pell General Store together, which meant walking side by side through the center of Harlow Creek, which Sadie understood would be noticed and commented upon within roughly 20 minutes. Horace Pell noticed immediately and managed to say nothing, which was so unlike him that Sadie thought it must be taking a significant physical effort. Margaret Dorsey happened to be at the store buying thread, and she greeted them both with magnificent innocence and chatted about thread for 5 full minutes, without once indicating that she found anything unusual about the situation, which told Sadie that she would be hearing about it in extensive detail the very next time they were alone. When they rode back out of town in the early afternoon, the sun was higher and the frost had gone from the road, and the valley felt warmer and wider. Tell me about Tennessee, Roy said. She told him. She told him about the rolling green hills and the way the light came through the dogwood trees in spring, and the summer heat that was thick and wet compared to the dry heat of Texas, and the way she had stood at the edge of their land in Tennessee and felt too confined by the trees, too hemmed in, like she could not see far enough. She told him how the idea of the West had felt like someone opening a window in a stuffy room. And was it what you expected? He asked. No, she said. It was harder and stranger and more beautiful and louder. Louder. The silence here is louder than anything I had ever experienced, she said. In Tennessee there was always something. Frogs, birds, wind in the leaves. Out here the silence has a weight to it. He nodded slowly. I know exactly what you mean. Where are you from? She asked, and realized that in all the years he had lived in Harlow Creek she had never known. Missouri, he said, a farm outside of Hannibal. My father raised horses. He paused. He died in '73 and my mother went to live with my sister in Kansas City. There wasn't anything to hold me in Missouri after that. So you just rode out. I just rode out, he agreed, without apology or self-consciousness. Do you ever miss it? Sometimes, he said. I miss the river mostly. The Missouri River is something to look at. He glanced at her. But there's nowhere I've felt more at home than this valley. She looked at the valley around them, the red earth walls and the pale winter grass and the enormous sky. "Yes," she said quietly. They reached her gate, which stood firmly latched on its post, reinforced and solid. Roy stepped down from Luther and held the bay mare's head while Sadie dismounted, and then he went to look at Pearl's leg in the barn. Sadie stood in the barn doorway and watched him crouch in the straw with Pearl, running his hands down the horse's leg with the same kind of focused gentleness he seemed to bring to everything. "Bruised," he said, rising. "She's been favoring it. Keep her in for a few days and she'll be fine." "Thank you," Sadie said. He nodded and came toward the barn door, and the proximity of him in the close, warm dimness of the barn was suddenly very present. He stopped a respectful distance from her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "I'd like to come calling," he said. "Formally, if you'd have me," she breathed. "Formally," she said. "Whatever pace you're comfortable with," he said. "I'm in no hurry except the hurry I can't seem to talk myself out of." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "Sunday afternoons." Something in his face settled. "Sunday afternoons," he said. He came that Sunday. He came on the one after that, and the one after that, and by Christmas of 1878 it had become the fixed point of the week, the thing Sadie found herself angling toward from Monday onward. He came in the afternoon, and they sat at the kitchen table with coffee and talked for hours, and then they sat on the porch in the cold, if the weather permitted, and watched the light change on the valley walls, and they talked about everything and nothing, the way people do when they are slowly, carefully, building something they intend to last. He told her about his years in Missouri, learning horses from his father, a quiet, methodical man who spoke to his animals the way other men spoke to their children. He told her about the years after his father's death, when he had drifted through 3 states doing the work of a traveling horseman, picking up skills and putting down roots before pulling them up again. He told her that there had been a woman in Abilene 2 years before he came to Harlow Creek, and that it had ended before it properly began because she had wanted someone willing to stay in a city and he could not do it. "I need land," he said. "Room to breathe." "I understand that," Sadie said. She told him about Daniel. She had not talked about Daniel this much since the year after his death, when grief had made her voluble in the way it sometimes does, pouring out of her in unexpected moments. What she told Roy now was different, quieter, the way you talk about someone you have had years to properly remember, finding the good and the complicated and the true. "He was not a quiet man," she said. One Sunday afternoon in January, the stove going and the coffee hot between them. He filled every room he walked into, not with noise exactly, but with presence. You always knew where Daniel was. Roy was quiet. "He would have liked you," she said, and she meant it. He respected people who were good at things. Roy turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I hope I could have deserved that," he said, and it was so genuinely modest that she felt something move in her chest. Margaret Dorsey said, at some point in January, when they were finally alone enough for the conversation that had been building, "Are you happy?" They were in Margaret's kitchen, putting up preserves that should have been done in the fall and were being done late because Margaret operated on a schedule entirely her own. "I think so," Sadie said. "I'm not sure I fully remember what happy feels like. What does it feel like right now?" Sadie thought about Sunday afternoons. She thought about the way Roy listened when she spoke, entirely with his whole attention, not waiting for his turn, but actually receiving what she said. She thought about the way he had fixed the coffee cup she dropped 2 Sundays ago, picking up the pieces without comment, and fitting them back together with a bit of paste he found in her sewing basket, and handing it back to her repaired, because he was apparently incapable of leaving a broken thing alone when he could mend it. "Like a window opening," she said. Margaret nodded, satisfied. By February they were walking together on Saturday afternoons, a long habit now, riding out along the creek or through the eastern meadows. By February Roy had fixed the creaking 3rd porch step, while she was inside making coffee one Sunday morning when he arrived early, and she had come out to find him on his knees with her toolbox, and she had stood in the doorway and let him finish because she understood now that this was how he spoke, with his hands, with his attention, with the things he noticed and quietly addressed. "You are the most observant person I have ever met," she told him one day. "My father said observation was the first courtesy," he said. "You can't be useful to someone if you're not paying attention to them." She thought about that for a long time after he had ridden away. On the first Sunday of March, he did not come at his usual time. She waited until 4 o'clock, which was later than he usually stayed, and he had not come by 3. She told herself that he had been delayed at the ranch, that any number of reasonable things could account for a man not appearing. She was not worried. She was certainly not watching the road from behind the kitchen curtain. At 4:15 she heard Luther's hoofbeats on the road, and then the clop as he turned into her gate, and she made herself walk normally to the door. Roy Ramsey was dusty and tired-looking, and he had a bandage wrapped around his right hand. "What happened?" she asked. "One of Horn's mares got tangled in some wire fencing," he said. "Took most of the day to calm her and get her free without her injuring herself more. I got tangled up too." He looked at his hand with the mild irritation of a man who finds his own injuries inconvenient rather than significant. "Come inside," she said, and her voice was steady and did not indicate anything about the strange, hollow feeling she had had for the past hour. She sat him at the kitchen table and unwrapped the bandage with careful hands and looked at the cut across his palm, which was long and shallow and had been cleaned tolerably but not well. She got her medicine box from the shelf and cleaned the cut properly with the carbolic solution she kept, which made his jaw tighten but not a word come out of him, and she wrapped it in clean linen with a neatness that would have made any nurse envious. "You've done this before," he said, watching her work. "Daniel," she said briefly. "He was always cutting himself on tools." His hand was warm and large in hers, and she tied off the bandage and did not let go of it immediately. He turned his hand over in hers gently so that his fingers wrapped around hers. She looked up at him. "Sadie," he said. That was all he said. Just her name in that low, quiet voice, and everything that needed to be communicated was communicated. She leaned forward slightly and he met her, and the kiss was careful and warm and brief, the kind of kiss that is a question and an answer at the same time. When she pulled back, she was pink and breathless and considerably less composed than she generally preferred to appear. "Well," she said. "Yes," he agreed. She stood up and went to put the kettle on because she needed something to do with herself, and from behind her she heard him say quietly, "I intend to ask you something important soon." She set the kettle on the stove. "I know," she said. "I wanted you to know it's coming." "I appreciate the forewarning," she said, and she turned to look at him, and he was watching her with those dark eyes that she had come to read now, the warmth in them visible to her even from across the room. He asked her the last Sunday of March. They were walking along the creek, where the first tentative green of spring was beginning to show in the willows along the bank, pale gold green against the brown of the winter-stripped land. The afternoon was warm enough that she had left her coat at the house, and the air smelled of mud and green things, and the particular freshness of a country beginning to wake up. He stopped walking and turned to face her, and she stopped too, because his face had that quality of stillness that she had learned meant he was about to say something important. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "I am asking you to marry me. I am aware that you are not a woman who needs managing or saving or taking care of, and I am not offering those things. What I'm offering is a partnership, someone to stand beside you on your land and help you work it and share whatever comes of it, good and hard. Someone to be in your house in the evenings." He paused. "Someone who has been observing you for 2 years and has not yet found a single thing he doesn't admire." She looked at him and felt the full weight of the moment, and thought about being 26 years old and standing at a grave in October wind, and thought about 3 years of managing alone, and thought about the way it had felt to fix her gait in the cold, dark mornings. "Yes," she said. He took a breath that had more feeling in it than almost anything she had ever seen from him, and then he reached out and took both her hands, and she gripped his back. "There's something you should know first," he said. I want to be honest with you about something I should have said before now. She waited. I don't have much, he said. I have Luther and my saddle and what I've saved from working at Horn's ranch. It's not nothing, but it's not land. It's not a house. I have a house, she said. I know, I'm aware that I'm coming to your land, not the other way around. I want you to know that I understand what that means and I don't take it lightly. This is your place, yours and Daniel's. She was quiet for a moment, thinking about that. Daniel built this house, she said. He would want it lived in fully. He would not want me to keep it as a monument. She met his eyes. And the land is my land. It will remain my land. I intend to make that clear in whatever arrangements we make. Absolutely, Roy said without hesitation. And you're not going to have opinions about how I run my kitchen garden. The corner of his mouth moved. Your kitchen garden is better run than anything I could manage. Good. And I'll sign whatever papers you need signed, he said. Whatever makes you feel secure, I mean that. She squeezed his hands. I know you do, she said. That's part of why the answer is yes. They were married in May of 1879, in the white church on the hill, on a morning of such extravagant springtime beauty that it felt like the valley itself was making an effort. Reverend Morrow performed the ceremony. Margaret Dorsey stood with Sadie and wept happy tears with absolutely no shame whatsoever. Clem Dorsey shook Roy's hand before and after the ceremony with equal vigor. Elia's Horn came from the ranch and stood in the back of the church and looked pleased in the quiet way of a man watching someone he respects get something they deserve. Sadie wore her blue dress, the best one, with white flowers from the kitchen garden tucked into her hair. Roy wore a jacket she had not seen before, dark gray wool new, and she understood that he had gone to considerable effort and expense to look his best for her, and she loved him for it. When Reverend Morrow said the words and Roy repeated them, his voice was low and steady, and she felt each word land, precise and permanent. When it was her turn, her voice was steady too. Afterward there was a gathering at the Dorsey house, the largest in that part of the valley, with food enough for twice the guests and music from a fiddle player named Cal Reeves who played until his arm must have ached. Sadie danced with Roy for the first time that afternoon in the Dorsey yard under the spring sky, and he danced the way he did everything, quietly competent and unhurried, his hand warm at the small of her back. I had no idea you could dance, she said. Missouri boys learn, he said simply. She laughed, and he smiled that slow sunrise smile, and Margaret, watching from the porch, finally said everything she wanted to say, but she said it only to Clem, who was used to it. That first year of their marriage was full in the way that only first years can be, full of the adjustments and revelations of two people learning to share a life. There were small frictions, the way there always are. Roy was an earlier riser than she, which she had not quite anticipated, and he had the habit of knowing where everything was within a day of it being placed, which was useful but slightly uncanny. He took over the management of the larger livestock matters from Clem Dorsey, which Sadie had discussed with Clem, who was relieved since his own herd had grown, and the percentage of the Beckett cattle had become more labor than profit. Roy and Clem came to their own arrangement about shared grazing on the north pasture, and Sadie found that the transition of the cattle management happened with remarkable smoothness, because Roy was as competent at practical negotiation as he was at everything else. She found that she did not resent his presence in her kitchen or at her table the way she had half feared she might. 3 years of alone had made her protective of her own rhythms, but Roy moved through her spaces without disturbing them, adapting himself to the household rather than requiring the household to adapt to him. He fixed the east shingles in June, as he had noted they needed attention. He built a proper feed storage area in the barn that solved a problem she had been working around for 2 years. He talked to the horses, all of them, in a low, continuous murmur when he was working around them, and Pearl, whose foreleg had long since healed, became visibly fond of him in the way horses become fond of people who pay them respectful attention. In the evenings, Roy sat at the kitchen table and read from whatever books they had, or worked on the small leather repairs that were always wanting doing. And Sadie sat across from him and sewed or read herself, and they talked, or they were quiet together. And it was the quiet that surprised her most. How good it was. How a silence shared with the right person was a different thing entirely from the silence of being alone. She wrote to her sister in Tennessee that summer, a letter that took 3 sittings to complete because she kept finding more to say. "He is a good man," she wrote. "He is, I think, one of the best people I have ever known, and I mean that carefully because I do not say things carelessly. He makes the farm feel like a shared enterprise rather than a burden. He makes the house feel inhabited rather than occupied. I did not know I was lonely until I was not anymore." In the autumn of 1879, in October, on almost exactly the 4th anniversary of Daniel Beckett's death, Sadie went to the church cemetery on the hill in the early morning. She went alone, as she always had on this day, and she stood at Daniel's grave with a small bunch of late wildflowers from the kitchen garden. She thought about him fully and without editing, the laugh and the large hands and the unfailing good nature and the way the light had gone out of the house when he left it. "I'm all right," she told him, which was what she always said. "The house is all right." She paused, and the October wind moved through the dry grass. "I didn't replace you. I want you to know that. What we had doesn't have a replacement. But I have found something good, and I think you would have said that was right." She stood there for a while, in the way that grief and love and time require, and then she walked back down the hill to her house and found Roy already up with the coffee made and breakfast started. And he looked at her face when she came in and said nothing, just poured her coffee and handed it to her, and she sat down and let the warmth of the mug and the warmth of the kitchen and the warmth of not being alone settle around her like a coat. "Thank you," she said. He sat down across from her. "For what?" "For understanding that there are things that don't need explaining." He looked at her steadily. "There are some things I understand without being told," he said. "Your face helps." "My face is not particularly readable," she said, because this was what she believed. "Your face," Roy said, "is extremely readable to me." She found she had nothing to argue with about that. The spring of 1880 brought new foals in the pasture and a wet March that turned the dry valley floor into a temporary meadow of wildflowers so extravagant they seemed painted there. It also brought news that Sadie was expecting a child. She told Roy on a morning in April when the light was new and gold across the kitchen floor and the coffee was steaming between them. She said it simply, watching his face. Roy Ramsey went very still. Then he reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, and he looked at her with such open and unguarded feeling that she felt her eyes sting, which surprised her. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I am very well," she said. "Are you happy about it?" She thought about the answer before she gave it, the way she thought about important things. "I am terrified," she said, "and I am the happiest I have been since before Daniel died, both of those things at the same time." He nodded, as though that made complete sense, as though the coexistence of terror and happiness was perfectly comprehensible to him. "Good," he said. "That sounds right." She laughed, and the laugh broke whatever restraint he had been maintaining, and he came around the table and pulled her up and held her with an urgency that told her everything she needed to know about how much the news meant to him. The pregnancy was, on the whole, a strong one. Margaret Dorsey appointed herself Sadie's primary support and cheerful advisor, a role she filled with great enthusiasm and only occasional unsolicited opinions. Roy managed the farm work without comment about what Sadie could or could not do, which she appreciated immensely, and only twice suggested she ought to rest, both times at moments when she had already been planning to, so she could not really object. In November of 1880, in the bedroom of the house Daniel Beckett had built on the south road of Harlow Creek, Texas, Sadie Ramsey gave birth to a boy. He was born in the early morning, the same early morning hour that his mother had spent 3 mornings fixing a gate latch the previous winter, and he came into the world with a considerable opinion about everything, expressed loudly and at length. which made Margaret, who was present, say that he had the disposition of someone who knew exactly what he wanted. They named him James Daniel Ramsey, the second name for the man who had built the house the boy was born in. Roy held his son in the lamplight of that November morning with the careful reverence of a man holding something precious and fragile, and Sadie, exhausted and entirely satisfied, watched his face and thought that love was a thing that did not diminish when it was distributed among more people, but grew proportionally. The way a candle flame passed to another candle loses nothing of itself. "Hello, James," Roy said very quietly to the baby in his arms. "I'm your father." Sadie closed her eyes, and the last thing she heard before she slept was the sound of her husband's voice telling their son about the valley, about the horses, about the way the light came over the ridge in the mornings, because Roy Ramsey was incapable of not telling the people he loved what he had observed about the world. James Daniel Ramsey proved to be, in the months that followed, a person of strong preferences and considerable will, which Roy found amusing and Sadie found both exhausting and familiar, since she had been told the same thing about herself by people who had known her as a child. He grew well and strongly, pulling himself upright along the furniture before he was properly 9 months old, setting off across the kitchen floor at 10 months in a purposeful and somewhat precarious walk that ended frequently in falls that he accepted with the pragmatism of someone who had decided that the goal was worth the falls. The town of Harlow Creek continued in its ways. Horace Pell got a new shipment of goods each season and reported on its contents to anyone within hearing range. The Reverend Morrow preached on Sundays and played a passable game of checkers on Tuesday evenings at the general store. Margaret and Clem Dorsey continued to be the closest thing to family that Sadie had in the valley, and their oldest daughter, Clara, who was 7, appointed herself James's honorary older sister from the first moment she was allowed to hold him. Roy Ramsey became, in the way of things in small towns, a figure of established respect rather than newcomer interest. He was known now as Sadie Ramsey's husband and James Ramsey's father as much as he was known as Elias Horne's best horseman, and he wore both identities with equal ease. He had spoken with Elias Horne in the spring of 1880 about reducing his hours at the ranch to part-time, and Horne had agreed because he could not afford to lose Roy entirely, and Roy had been fair enough to make the arrangement workable. The Beckett property had become the Ramsey property in deed and in name, though Sadie kept a version of her original deed filed in her own name as well, because she was a woman who believed in the importance of papers. In the summer of 1882, when James was almost 2 years old, Roy came in from the north pasture one July afternoon with the slightly deliberate look he got when he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while. "Elias Horne has offered me the northeast section of his land," Roy said. "He's looking to reduce what he's working, and he's offered me a fair price on 30 acres with a water right." Sadie set down the bread she had been working and looked at him fully. "It would be adjacent to our north pasture," Roy said. "It would double our cattle capacity." "Can we afford it?" she asked. "Between what I've saved and what we have together, we're short by about a third," he said. "I've spoken to the bank in Comanche. They'll lend against the property at a rate I think is manageable." She thought about it. She thought about Daniel, who had built the house with a carpenter's faith in sound construction and expanding plans, and she thought about what it meant to have more land in this valley, more room, more capacity. "Show me the section," she said. He took her out the next morning, just the two of them, with James left in Margaret Dorsey's capable hands, and they rode the 30 acres together on a morning of brilliant summer heat, Luther and Pearl moving through the dry grass, and Roy showed her the water right, the way the land lay, the section of creek bank that would make year-round cattle management possible. She rode the fence line twice and thought about it. "What's the risk?" she asked. "If we have a bad cattle year, we might find the loan hard to service," he said. "But with the water right, a genuinely bad year becomes much less likely. The creek doesn't go dry even in drought, and Horne won't regret selling it." He's keeping the larger section to the west. He's an old man and he's tired. He'd rather see it go to someone who'll work it than watch it sit. She looked at the land around her, the red earth and the dry summer grass and the creek line in the distance with its belt of cottonwoods. "All right," she said. They bought the land in September of 1882, and the papers were signed with both their names, Roy Ramsey and Sarah Beckett Ramsey, and the bank officer in Comanche said he had never seen a couple argue so politely and productively about the order of names on a deed. The cattle operation grew steadily over the following years. Roy had a gift for it that went beyond the horsework that had originally defined him, a kind of practical intelligence about land and animals and the particular arithmetic of frontier agriculture that was more art than science. Sadie managed the books and the planting and the kitchen garden, which had expanded into a substantial kitchen farm by 1883, and she found in the combined work of their shared enterprise the particular satisfaction of something done well and done together. James grew at the rate children grow, which is to say shocking quickly and in all directions at once. By the time he was 3, he was following his father to the barn every morning with a small and absolutely determined purpose, and by 4 he was sitting on Luther's back in the corral, small hands tangled in the gray mane, with a look of transcendent concentration that made Roy stand at the fence rail and watch with an expression Sadie had taken to thinking of as his full-heart expression. In the spring of 1884, Sadie told Roy she was expecting again. This time there was no terror in the announcement, or very little. She had been here before. She knew what it asked of her and she knew she could answer. Roy's response was the same as the first time. Still, and then her hand in both of his, and then, "Are you well?" "I am well," she said. "Good," he said. This time the conversation that followed was fuller, warmer, already familiar with what lay ahead. They talked about James and how he would respond to a sibling, about the timing relative to the cattle work, about whether they ought to ask Roy's sister in Kansas City to come for a spell. Roy wrote to his sister, Clara Ramsey, who had married a merchant there, and Clara wrote back promptly that she would come in September and stay through the winter if needed, which was exactly the kind of decisive generosity that Sadie had come to understand was a family trait. The second child was born in October of 1884, another morning baby, another strong voice announcing an opinion about existence. This one was a girl, round and emphatic, with dark hair that came in thick by the time she was 3 months old. They named her Eleanor Rose Ramsey. Eleanor for Roy's mother, Rose for the rose bushes along Sadie's porch that had been growing there since before Sadie arrived, planted by the family that had first broken the land, persistent and thorny, and every June extravagantly beautiful. James, who was 4, received his sister with initial suspicion and eventual proprietorial fondness. He brought her things: pebbles from the creek, a feather he had found, the wooden horse Roy had carved for him the previous Christmas, which was a considerable sacrifice. He stood at the side of the cradle and watched her with the intensity of someone trying to understand a new and complicated mechanism. "She's very small," he told his father. "You were that small," Roy said. James found this implausible and said so at length. Clara Ramsey, Roy's sister, stayed through December and proved to be a person of great warmth and tremendous efficiency, and she and Sadie liked each other immediately in the uncomplicated way that happens sometimes when 2 practical women meet and recognize each other. Clara said, on the morning she was leaving to return to Kansas City, that she had never seen her brother at ease the way he was now. "He was always a good man," she said to Sadie at the kitchen table with their last coffee together, "but he was wound up tight, like a good piece of rope that nobody was using for anything." "Now he's being used, if you know what I mean," Sadie smiled. "I know what you mean. You did that," Clara said simply. "I want you to know I see that." "He did it too," Sadie said. "Of course he did, but it takes 2 people to pull a rope taut." Clara stood up and put her coat on. "Come to Kansas City sometime, both of you, bring the children." "We will," Sadie said. Roy's sister kissed his cheek at the door and held both his hands for a moment, and he looked at her with the quiet depth that was his way of showing feeling. And she nodded as though he had said several things, because she knew him well enough to hear what he did not say. The years that came after were built of the ordinary, extraordinary material of a life, seasons and work, and the growth of children, and the slow deepening of a marriage that had started from something careful and became something rooted and sure. James, at 5 and 6 and 7, became his father's shadow in the best possible sense, learning horses with the same patience and observation that Roy had, learning the land and the cattle, and the particular work of knowing a place well enough to understand what it needed. He was a quiet boy, like his father, with his mother's occasional flash of iron determination, and the combination made him someone who thought before he acted, but acted decisively when he did. Alina was different. Alina was loud and curious and boundlessly energetic and apparently physically fearless, qualities that gave Sadie some anxious moments and Roy considerable amusement. She fell out of the oak tree at the edge of the yard at age 3 and went straight back up. She led every game in which James could be persuaded to participate. She had opinions about horses by the time she could walk, and Roy said, watching her stand at the pasture fence at 4 years old lecturing Luther about something, that she had a gift. The gate on the south side of the yard had by now been repaired so many times and so thoroughly that it was a different gate in almost every component from the original, the only continuity being the iron latch, which had been replaced twice, but was of the same type and sat in the same place. Sadie had a habit of touching it when she came and went, a small unconscious gesture, like touching a familiar scar. Roy had noticed this, of course. "You touch the gate latch every time you pass it," he said, one evening in 1886, sitting on the porch in the last light of a September day. "I do," she said, though she had known she did. "Every time for as long as I've been paying attention." She looked at the gate, just visible in the fading light. "It's funny to think about," she said. "That was how this started, really." He was quiet in a way that meant he was paying full attention. "That gate latch," she said. 3 mornings of fixing it. I didn't know I was sending a message. I told myself it was just because the sound was keeping me awake." "Was it?" She smiled at the gate in the dusk. "No," she said, "or not entirely. Every morning I went out there I thought, maybe this morning he'll stop. Maybe this morning he'll say something." She looked at Roy. "You said something on the 3rd morning." "I had been working up to it," he said. "You don't seem like a man who works up to things." "I work up to things that matter," he said. She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand over his, the way she had come to do in the evenings when the day was done and the children were asleep and the house breathed quietly around them. "I am glad you stopped," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. "So am I," he said. In 1887, James turned 7 and Roy began teaching him properly to ride. Not just to sit on a horse, which James had been doing since before he could properly walk, but to ride the way Roy rode, with understanding and communication, and the particular conversation between a rider and a horse that is more feeling than instruction. Sadie watched from the fence rail as Roy led James through the first lessons in the corral, and she thought about the gray horse Luther, now 12 years old and slower but still sound, and she thought about the bay mare Roy had brought for her on their first Saturday ride into town, and she thought about a man who had noticed her horse was limping from the road. She thought about the quality of attention that had defined her marriage, the way of being seen fully and without reduction, and she understood that this was the thing Roy was passing on to James in that corral, because you cannot teach a child to attend to horses without teaching them to attend fully to the living things in their world. Alina, not yet 3, stood beside her mother at the fence rail and watched her brother with an expert air. "My turn," Alina said. "Not yet, love," Sadie said. "But I could do that," Alina said. "I know you could," Sadie said. "Your turn will come." It came as turns do. It always came. In 1888, Harlow Creek got a telegraph office, which connected the valley to the wider world with a speed that still felt remarkable to people who had spent most of their lives measuring distance in days of travel. The town had grown steadily through the decade, new families arriving, a second general store opening to compete with Horace Pell's, a proper hotel being built on the main street. A schoolhouse was finally under proper construction, separate from the church, with room for 40 students and a real teacher hired from Dallas. Sadie enrolled James in the new school in the fall of 1888, and he went with the serious purpose of someone who had been looking forward to learning things he could not learn at home, which was, his mother thought, exactly the right approach to education. She had taught him his letters and his numbers herself, as she had been taught, and he could read and write well enough. But there was something he found in the schoolhouse, in the structure of formal learning, that suited him in the same way the corral suited him. A defined space with clear goals and measurable progress. Roy walked him to the schoolhouse on the first day, both of them serious about it, and Sadie watched them go from the porch and felt the particular tenderness of watching a man love a child well, which was its own kind of thing entirely separate from and added to everything else. Eleanor, who was 4, watched her brother go with a look of pure calculation on her small face that Sadie recognized as the preliminary to a sustained campaign. And sure enough, Eleanor spent the next several weeks making a comprehensive case for why she should also be allowed to attend school, until Sadie explained that she would start school in 2 years, and in the meantime, she could begin learning to read properly right here at the kitchen table. Eleanor considered this, accepted the terms, and appointed herself a student of considerable dedication. By the spring she was reading from the same primer James had used, at a pace, and with a ferocity that made Sadie think she might have a reader on her hands the same way Sadie herself had been a reader, someone for whom books were not a pleasure so much as a necessity. The winter of 1888 was a hard one, the hardest since Sadie had come to Texas. It came early, and it stayed long, and it pushed down from the north in 3 separate storms that buried the valley floor in a foot of snow, which was something that happened rarely enough that the town had not fully prepared for it. The cattle needed daily management through the worst of it, supplemental feed and breaking ice in the water troughs, and Roy spent the worst days moving between the barn and the north pasture from before dawn until after dark, returning to the house cold enough that Sadie took to having a hot meal and a change of clothes ready at the door. She did the barn work herself in the mornings, so Roy could start on the north pasture without delay. She was in the barn before 6 every morning, moving in the specific warmth of the animal space, doing the work she had been doing alone for 3 years before Roy came, and had never stopped knowing how to do. The work had a satisfying physicality to it, the weight and rhythm of it, the specific competence of a body that knows what it is doing. Roy came in one evening in the middle of the worst week, and found the barn work already done and Sadie at the kitchen stove with Eleanor and James at the table, and he stood in the kitchen doorway with the cold coming off him and looked at his family and said nothing for a moment. "Everything all right?" Sadie asked. "Everything's fine," he said. He came in and shut the door and took off his coat. "Everything is exactly right." She looked at him with those dark eyes and understood. The spring that followed the hard winter came with an extravagance that seemed like an apology. The valley floor bloomed in colors that Sadie had not seen before or since, fields of bluebonnet and Indian paintbrush and things she had no name for, and the creek ran high and clean, and the new calves came healthy and numerous, and Roy walked the north pasture in the April light with the look of a man who has weathered something and found himself, at the end of it, intact. James, 8 years old, walked beside him on these survey walks, and Eleanor, 5, trotted behind, asking questions at a rate that required Roy to think fast. Eleanor's questions were the kind that sounded simple and contained depths. Why did the grass grow in patches there and evenly here? Why did the creek bend right and not left? Why did some cows always go to the east fence and others to the west? Roy answered every question with the same seriousness he brought to adult conversation, because he had decided early that children's questions deserved the same quality of answer as anyone else's, and because Alina's questions frequently turned out to be good ones. In 1890, Sadie's sister, the one she had been writing to since the beginning, came to visit from Tennessee. Her name was Ruth, and she arrived on the stage from San Antonio with a trunk, 2 hat boxes, and the faintly dazed look of someone who had just crossed the better part of a continent. She was 3 years younger than Sadie, a widow herself now, her husband having died 2 years prior, and she carried this loss with the fresh rawness of grief that had not yet had time to change shape. Sadie met her at the stage stop and held her for a long time. Ruth stayed for 6 weeks, and the household expanded to hold her without any particular adjustment, the way houses do when they are happy houses. Roy was exactly himself with Ruth, quiet and attentive and capable, and by the end of the first week Ruth had said to Sadie privately that she understood now from the letters. "I understand now from the letters," she said. "What do you understand?" Sadie asked. "That he is what you said he was," Ruth said. "I wasn't sure anyone was quite what they were described to be in letters, but he is," Sadie smiled. "Yes," she said, "he is." Ruth watched the children with a particular quality of feeling that Sadie recognized as grief-adjacent, the specific ache of someone who had wanted children and had not had them. She was good with James and Alina, patient and interested, and Alina decided within approximately 48 hours that Aunt Ruth was one of the best people in the world and attached herself accordingly. On the evening before Ruth left, Sadie and Roy sat with her on the porch in the September warmth, and they talked into the dark, about Tennessee and Texas and the years between. Roy spoke more than he usually did with people he didn't know well, and Sadie thought it was because he understood that Ruth needed to talk, needed to be surrounded by the sound of other people's lives while she was still finding the outline of her new one. "You should come again," Roy said to Ruth when they were walking back inside. "I think I will," Ruth said. Ruth did come again, the following summer, and the summer after that, and eventually she stopped going back to Tennessee between visits, which was a change in circumstance that settled into place so gradually that by 1893, it was simply understood that Ruth Morgan was the aunt who lived on the south pasture in the small second house that Roy had built for her in 1892. A solid 2-room structure in the same style as the main house, set back from the road among the oak trees. The building of that house had been Roy's suggestion, and Sadie had cried when he first proposed it, not the quiet, composed tears that she generally permitted herself, but the less controlled kind that come when something is more generous than you expected. Ruth had wept too when she was told, and Roy had looked at both of them with the mild alarm of a man who had not anticipated this outcome but was not sorry about it. "I just thought," he said, "that family should be close." "It's the right thing," Sadie said, drying her eyes. "There's room on the south pasture," he said, "and she likes it here, and James and Alina are going to need her when they're older." He was not wrong about that. James, at 12, had begun the stage of boyhood where he sought the company of people outside his immediate family, and Ruth was one of the people he went to, drawn by her different quality of attention, the way she asked him about his thoughts rather than his activities. Alina, at 8, had already formed an alliance with Ruth based on their shared passion for books, and the two of them were found regularly in Ruth's parlor with their noses in whatever volumes Ruth had acquired from the traveling bookseller who came through Harlow Creek twice a year. Roy, watching this, said once to Sadie, "I never had that. Someone like that outside the family." "You have Clem Dorsey," she said. "That's true," he said. "Different, though." "Yes," she agreed. "Different." The cattlemen's difficulties of the early 1890s, the collapse of the cattle boom that had built the Texas economy through the previous decade, touched the Ramsey operation as it touched every ranch in the valley. The prices dropped, the market changed, and there were 2 lean years that required careful management and the kind of patient recalculation that Roy applied to these things with his characteristic steadiness. They did not lose land. They did not lose stock, or not more than could be sustained. They tightened where they could and they held what mattered, and by 1894 the worst of it was past. Harlow Creek survived those years too, and came out of them changed but intact, the way communities in the West tended to do, shed of some people and some enterprises that had been marginal, but its roots, the families and the farms and the land itself, still solid. James, 15 in 1895, was by then a young man in the way that young men on working ranches become young men, fast and usefully. He had Roy's quality of attention with horses and land, and the school in Harlow Creek had given him a quality of education that was, his teacher said, as good as anything available in the county. He was the kind of student who asked questions that made teachers think, and he was the kind of son who made his parents proud in the understated way that is more meaningful than the other kind. Eleanor, 11, had already decided what she wanted to be, which was a teacher, and she said so with the firmness of someone who has considered many options and made a final selection. She was reading above her age and writing with a clarity and confidence that Sadie recognized as genuine, and she had taken to helping the younger students at the school on the days when the teacher needed assistance, because Eleanor's approach to helping was to explain things in 3 different ways until one of them landed, which was, her teacher said, a genuine pedagogical instinct. Sadie, standing in the doorway of the school one afternoon watching Eleanor, explained long division to a 7-year-old with 3 different analogies and considerable patience, felt the full weight of satisfaction that is available only to parents who see their children becoming who they actually are. She told Roy that evening. She explained long division, Sadie said, by comparing it to dividing up a herd of cattle and then by comparing it to splitting a pie, and when neither of those worked she compared it to distributing hay equally among stalls. The third one worked. Roy, sitting across the table, looked up from the harness he was mending. "Good thinker," he said. "She's going to be remarkable," Sadie said. "She already is," Roy said. Sadie looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight. This man she had married on a May morning in 1879 and built 16 years beside. This man who had crouched at her broken gate latch and told her the truth plainly and ridden beside her at 9 o'clock on a Saturday and asked her to marry him at the end of March by a creek where the willows were going green. "What are you thinking?" he asked, because he was watching her face. "I'm thinking about the gate latch," she said. He set down the harness. "Are you?" "I was telling Margaret last week," she said, "about how we started, and I realized I still don't know exactly what I was doing out there 3 mornings in a row. I mean, I know what I told myself I was doing, but what I was actually doing." Roy considered this with his full attention. "I think," he said slowly, "that you were doing the bravest kind of thing, the kind where you're not quite ready to be brave, so you give yourself a reason that isn't the real reason. And you go out there every morning with your toolbox and you're thinking about the gate, but you're really thinking about the man who rides past it." She was quiet. "And one morning the man has the sense to stop," he said. "He did take 3 mornings," she said. "He was a little slow," Roy agreed. She laughed, and he smiled, and across the table in the lamplight they were both, in that moment, exactly where they had been building toward from the beginning, rooted and certain and full. In 1896, James turned 16, and the conversation about his future became a real one. He had been talking for 2 years about horses, specifically about the breeding and training of working quarter horses for the ranching operations that were the economic life of the Texas Valley system. He had ideas that he had clearly been developing privately for some time, ideas about bloodlines and training methods, and the kind of specific operation that Roy's skills and the Ramsey land might support. Roy listened to his son's proposal at the kitchen table one spring evening with the complete and unpartisan attention he brought to any serious proposition, and then he asked 7 questions, each of which James answered with a precision that indicated he had anticipated them. When James was done, Roy looked at Sadie. She had been listening too. She looked back at Roy and then at her son. It's your father's call on the horse breeding, she said. That's his expertise and his land section. But if you're asking whether I think the idea has merit, yes, I do, Roy nodded. We'll need a proper second corral, he said, and we'll need to be careful about the first 3 years. It's not going to return quickly. I know, James said. You'll finish school first, Roy said. Of course, James said. Roy extended his hand across the table and James took it. That handshake was the beginning of the Ramsey horse breeding operation that would, in the years that followed, develop into the best-regarded quarter horse source in the county. But that was in the future. In 1896, it was a plan, and a handshake, and a father and son looking at each other with the particular respect that comes when a parent recognizes a grown person standing where a child was. Sadie refilled everyone's coffee. Alina, who had been doing her school preparation at the end of the table and pretending not to be listening, said, I have a plan too when you're ready. We're listening, Sadie said. Not tonight, Alina said with great self-restraint. Tonight is James's night. I'll have mine another time. Roy looked at his daughter with that full heart expression. Fair enough, he said. Alina's plan, which she presented 2 weeks later, also at the kitchen table, was to pursue teachers' training in San Antonio, where a proper program had been established for women wanting to become school teachers, and then to return to Harlow Creek and teach at the school where she had been educated. She presented this with a thoroughness that was entirely Alina, covering the cost, the duration, the return timeline, and the anticipated impact on the Harlow Creek school. Sadie and Roy looked at each other, and the look contained everything: pride and the ache of a child leaving and the certainty that this was exactly right. You've thought about this for a long time, Sadie said. Since I was 8, Alina said. Roy laughed, startled into it. Since you were 8, he said. I decided when I helped that boy understand long division, she said. I decided that was what I wanted to do. Sadie thought about standing in the schoolhouse doorway watching her daughter explain long division 3 different ways. She thought about a 9-year-old girl asking why the grass grew in patches. She thought about a small person in a barn speaking to horses with the same matter-of-fact confidence she brought to everything. All right, Sadie said. San Antonio. Alina went to San Antonio in 1899, when she was 15, which was younger than Sadie would have wished but was the standard age for the program, and Alina was entirely ready in every way that mattered. Ruth took her to the stage and wept quietly all the way back, because Ruth had found in Alina the reader companion she had never had in Tennessee, and the house felt emptier when she was gone. James, 19, was by then fully partnered in the horse breeding operation, and had grown into the kind of young man who did not require managing, because he had internalized the standards he held himself to. He had a particular friend in town, the son of the new minister who had replaced the retired Reverend Morrow, a young man named Henry Cole, and they had the easy companionship of people who had known each other through the malleable years of boyhood and had decided, coming out the other side, that they liked who they had become. The turn of the century came to Harlow Creek as it came everywhere, with a mixture of celebration and the particular weight of a number that marked something. January 1, 1900 was a cold, clear day in the valley, and Sadie stood on her porch with Roy beside her and looked at the same ridge and the same sky she had been looking at since 1872, unchanged by the number, immovable by time. 28 years since I came here, she said. 24 since I did, he said. They stood in the cold morning air, and the valley held them in the way it had always held them, with that quality of enormous indifferent beauty that does not care about human things but is entirely improved by their presence. Are you content? She asked him, using the word she always used for this question because happiness was a mood and contentment was a state, and she was asking about his state. Yes, he said, without hesitation. Me too, she said. He put his arm around her in the cold morning, and she leaned into him in the way she had come to lean, with full trust and no reserve, and they watched the light come up over the ridge together. Alina came home from San Antonio in 1902, fully certified as a teacher and entirely unchanged in the essential Alina ways, full of opinions and energy, and the particular restlessness of someone ready to begin doing what they have spent years preparing for. She walked into the Harlow Creek schoolhouse and was received by the students with the same enthusiasm she had inspired as a student, because Alina had the rare quality of a person who is fully present with whoever she is talking to, and children recognized it instinctively. She taught in Harlow Creek for the following years, and the school became known throughout the county as a place of genuine education rather than just adequate instruction. She never married, which occasioned some comment in Harlow Creek, and she considered the comment and dismissed it with Alina's characteristic thoroughness because she had made a decision about what her life was for, and a marriage she did not specifically want was not part of it. Sadie respected this completely and said so. Roy, when Alina told him, said, "You should live exactly as you want to." "I know," Alina said. "I'm just telling you so you know." "Good," he said. "Thank you for telling me." This was a conversation that could have gone several other ways and did not, which Alina would remember and appreciate for the rest of her life. James, in 1903, brought home a young woman named Anna Reeves, daughter of the fiddle player who had played at Roy and Sadie's wedding. Anna was 22 and had the particular quality of someone who grew up making music in a family, a sensitivity to the atmosphere of a room, a way of reading people quickly and accurately. She and James had been keeping company quietly for 8 months before he brought her home, which James's mother noted without comment, since James had always processed things at his own deliberate pace. Sadie liked Anna immediately, not because she was James's choice, but because of the way she sat at the kitchen table and asked questions about the kitchen garden with genuine interest, and because of the way she listened to Roy explain something about a horse and asked a follow-up question that showed she had heard the whole thing. Roy liked her because she laughed at things that were actually funny and did not laugh at things that were not, which he found to be a reliable indicator of good character. James asked her to marry him in the spring of 1904, and she said yes, and the announcement at the kitchen table was received with the kind of warm and relatively restrained celebration appropriate to a family that expressed feeling in the Roy Ramsey manner, which was to say deeply, and without a lot of noise about it. They were married in June of 1904, in the same white church on the hill, and Sadie wore her best dress again and Roy wore his good jacket, which was a different jacket from the wedding jacket of 1879, but occupied the same dignified position in the wardrobe, and they stood in the front pew and watched their son make the same promises they had made 25 years earlier. The feelings available in that moment were complicated and layered in the way that feelings tend to be when you are watching something you love echo itself forward into the future. Sadie took Roy's hand during the ceremony and he held it, and neither of them needed to say anything. The first Ramsey grandchild was born in 1905. He was a boy, as James and Anna's firstborn, and they named him Roy Daniel Ramsey, which meant the name of his grandfather and the name of the man who had built the house he was born in. And when Sadie held that baby in the lamplight of the room that had been her and Daniel's bedroom, and then her and Roy's bedroom, she thought that the continuity of a life lived with intention was visible in the faces of children, and she was overwhelmed with a feeling she had no single word for. Roy held him too, this small person named partly for him, and the full heart expression was on his face with an openness that was the accumulated openness of a man who had spent 26 years with someone who had made it safe to be seen. "Hello, Roy," he said quietly to the baby, same as he had said to James and to Alina, and then he looked at Sadie across the small bundled weight of their first grandchild, and she looked back at him. And the gate latch was in the morning cold, and the creek in the March thaw, and the Saturday ride, and the May wedding, and the summer, and the winter, and the 26 years were all there in that look, all of it held between them, complete and continuing. They walked home from James and Anna's that night under the stars, the road familiar under their feet, the cold air of a Texas autumn carrying the smell of dry grass and distance. And the gate of the south yard was ahead of them, solid on its post, the iron latch glinting faintly in the starlight. Roy lifted the latch and held the gate for her, and she passed through, and he followed, and he let the gate swing closed behind them, and the latch settled into place with the clean sound of a thing working exactly as it was meant to. She stopped on the path and looked back at the gate, and then she looked at him. 26 years ago, she said, I thought I was fixing a gate. He came to stand beside her and looked at the gate with her, at the latch she had fixed 3 mornings in a row in the cold dark, while telling herself it was just about the sound it made in the wind. You were fixing a gate, he said, and sending a message I didn't know I was sending. I knew, he said. She looked at him. On which morning? The 3rd one, he said. When you were there again in the dark before dawn and your hands were red from the cold and you had your toolbox. That's when I knew it wasn't about the gate. What did you think it was about? He considered the gate for a moment, and then he looked at her with the dark eyes she had been reading for 26 years. I thought it was about not being alone any longer, he said, and not quite knowing how to say so. She stood beside him in the starlight, this woman who had crossed the plains with hope and stubbornness packed into her wagon, who had built a life alone and then built a different life together, whose children were grown and whose grandchild had her husband's name, and she thought that he was right, and that he had always been right about the things that mattered. You stopped, she said. I stopped, he said. Thank you for stopping. He took her hand, the same hand he had held at their wedding and at their children's births and across every kitchen table evening for more than 2 decades, and they stood at the gate of their yard in the cold autumn starlight, and the valley held them and the house lights behind them were warm, and everything they had was here, everything, present and whole and continuing. Come inside, she said. Yes, he said. They went inside together, and the door closed behind them, and the gate stood latched on its post in the quiet dark, holding